All right, welcome everybody to our live stream event, a Nature's Past niche and ASCH Environmental History Week event that we're calling What's Next for Canadian Environmental History. I'll be the host of this panel. My name's Sean Courage, and I am the Director of the Network in Canadian History and Environment, and I'm also the producer of the Nature's Past podcast. And I'm joined by four esteemed guests here from the Canadian Environmental History research community. I'll go in the order as they appear in our grid. We've got Shannon Stunden Bower here over to my right. Hey, Shannon.
Hello.
So Shannon, you're joining us from University of Alberta. We've also got below her there, we've got Heather Green. Hey, Heather.
Hey there.
And Heather's coming to us from St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia. And then finally, we have the founding director of the Network in Canadian History and Environment, Alan MacEachern. Hi, Alan.
Hey, Sean. Hey, everyone.
All right. So normally we might do a single land acknowledgement, but for these virtual events, we're coming from all kinds of places. And those of you who are watching live may be coming from places outside of Canada, places within Canada. So we thought we would share with you the Indigenous territories from which we are each broadcasting from. So I'll begin. I'm based in Toronto, or the area known as Takronto, which has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, and the current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory where I am is also the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Heather, where are you joining us from?
So I am in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is located in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nation.
And Shannon, you're way out in Alberta.
Yeah, so I'm here in the city of Edmonton, Alberta. This is in Treaty 6 territory, and it is also a traditional gathering place for a number of Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, as well as other Indigenous peoples. It's long been an important gathering place.
And Alan, you're just down the road from me in London, Ontario.
That's right. London is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Etowondran people, on lands connected with the London Township and Somerset Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant.
So our panel today is a kind of a look into the future of Canadian environmental history, some predictions of what we might be seeing down the road. Those of us who are joining us in the chat live on YouTube, we invite you to post questions in there for the panelists that I'll relay over to them for the discussion today. And of course, for those of you who weren't able to attend the live session, you already know that there was a recording because you're watching it right now. And you can find it over on the Nature's Past YouTube channel and the niche website at niche-canada.org. So I'm going to start things off with the question for the panel, and maybe I will ask Shannon to start us off here. What is next, in your view, for Canadian environmental history?
This was the hardest question, I thought. Sean gave us a number of questions to think about in advance, which I very much appreciated. But it was tough when I found the first one really challenging. And I sort of thought for a while why I found question one particularly hard. And ultimately, I think it's because there's a whole bunch of things ahead. As I see it, the field is now big enough and diverse enough that I think it's really difficult to offer one single prediction. And I think that's a good thing.
All right. I will turn it over then to Alan to maybe kick us off on this one as well. What do you think, Alan?
Well, I should maybe warn you and warn our audience today that I got my vaccine yesterday, and I'm really wiped out today. So anything I say can't be held against me. Didn't sleep well last night. But it did mean that I wanted to make sure I wrote some notes in advance. I may have written most of my notes about this question, actually. So Shannon, you were wonderfully brief, and I'm just going to go crazy here, okay? I'm going to focus on something that's obviously been important to me, which is niche. I'm going to focus specifically on that. And also, I want to get my hard-hitting stuff out of the way early. I hope that in the coming years, niche takes on some of the characteristics of an association. Not all the way. I don't think it should become an association of Canadian history and environment, not just because I like that we're a network. And also niche is a better acronym than ACHE. I'm not aching for ache. But I'd like to see it more transparent how people can get involved in niche, how they can join the executive, how they can even dream someday to be director. And I don't think enough people know because niche really hasn't been telling anybody. And I'd like to have niche send me an invoice for membership dues every year. I'm not saying everybody needs to pay, but folks like me who have professional development funds, we could pay some in a heartbeat. In our society, we value things that have cost and people get more invested. I've always believed people get more invested if they're originally invested. And plus niche, I think, could do things with the money if only have guaranteed matching funds for SHRC grants for our yearly chess. And now here's where I get hard hitting, and then I'm going to get this out of the way. I say this in part because I already see how much Canadians spend on the American Society for Environmental History. You look at the canceled ASEH 2020 in Ottawa, more than 100 Canadians on the program, just under 1/4 of the total. The year before that in Columbus, Ohio, just under 10% of the program. In Ottawa, between ASEH membership and registration, Canadians easily spent well over 20,000 American and gave it to the ASEH. And I don't think we get full value of it. 0 environmental historians of Canada have ever won an ASEH non-student award, which I find pretty shocking, actually, compared to, for example, 5 working on the environmental history of Japan. Only 2 environmental historians of Canada have ever sat on the ASEH Council. That might double this year, Sean, if you and Matthew Evenden make it a board, and I hope you do. Or you can look at the ASEH's Committee on Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. 27 members, but none of them Canadian. The committee hosted a workshop series last fall with 14 speakers, and all of them American. I don't think that's good. And it makes it appear that the ASEH is not so much about supporting its members as supporting its American members. Canada tends to be both too foreign and too familiar to be of much interest to American environmental history and maybe to the American society. So when my membership comes due, I'm going to let it lapse this year. And I'm going to put the funds to that Canadian Environmental History Award that we started up. So that's me getting my stuff out of the way before I collapse here post-vaccine.
This is very good because I think there's a lot there I think I want to pick up on, but I'll let Heather get her thoughts in next on what's next, and maybe we'll pick up on some of these pieces, see what others think. Heather?
Sure. So I also, like Shannon said, this is kind of the one that I thought about the most. And in some ways, I think because I felt like there were so many different directions to go in. So I won't, like, some are teaching, some are research, which we'll talk about later. But funny, like with Alan, actually some of my initial thoughts also involved niche. And so, thinking about what's next for this particular question, I think I'm thinking about it more in terms of like approaches, but also engagement. And what I guess what I'm thinking is that we were just chatting earlier before we went live about the readership and viewership of niche this past year, and how it's really in some cases it's tripled and or doubled or quadrupled what it has been in previous years. And I think in some ways that indicates a couple of things. One, there are things that niche has been doing lately to maybe engage more with readers. Of course, the pandemic plays a role in how people are engaging with Canadian environmental history. But I also think it indicates that there's maybe more demand for environmental history of Canada. When we see more people engaging with the things that niche is featuring, I think it does suggest that people are interested. And I think some of the things that niche has done in the past year like producing really strong series like the HBC series, like Jessica DeWitt's Queering Environmental History series, are indicating things that people have, that we're sort of craving more on these topics. But I also think that events that we've been putting on, like various live panels, like the niche conversations on Instagram, there are more ways for people to engage with environmental history that's a little more public oriented. And I feel like that's an important sort of next step for Canadian environmental history, is to think about how we can connect better to the public sphere and like bring our work in ways that are maybe more accessible to more people. So that's sort of one part of it. And I guess connected to that too, like thinking about trends moving forward. And so, you know, I was saying earlier, I only started like grad school 10 years ago, like environmental history. So like Shannon and Alan and Sean, you would have like a better sense of this than I would. But like from what I've noticed from my entry into environmental history to now, is that I feel like we are making maybe slow progress, but progress in terms of greater engagement and connection between environmental historians and the public. So I'm thinking of like like collaborative projects maybe in the past few years where environmental historians are engaging with different disciplines a little bit better, but also with the public. So there's work like Brittany Luby's project on the Monoman Project and her collaborators outside of academia, Josh McFadgen's digital history work with communities in PEI. Lisa Piper's been involved with land-based learning in the Northwest Territories and communities there. So I think that we have done a little better to connect more broadly with public history in a sense, and with communities, and finding ways that environmental history can be related outside of the academy, which are things that I think are sort of, you know, some of the ways that's what's next for Canadian environmental history, and things that I think are really exciting, and I hope that we see more of as well.
Okay, I've got a few that I want to put on the table as well here. Maybe I'll do three. So one will be research, one will be teaching, and one will be, let's say, like organization. So the first on research, I think, in terms of what might lie ahead for Canadian environmental history, I think is maybe a reflection more on a trend that I think I'm seeing or have been seeing over the past couple of years, which is, you know, the tent is getting bigger in terms of integrations with other fields. So I'm thinking about research that integrates more scholarship from Indigenous studies, research that looks at environmental justice. And as the field in Canada becomes a little bit broader, you know, we're seeing fewer references to Cronin, Crosby, Merchant, and more references to a wider range of scholarship that's connecting environmental history more broadly. Of course, that comes with the caveat that the field maybe is losing its definition. It's not as sharply defined, perhaps, as it was in the past around methodologies about thinking about materialism in the past. And that might be something that's worth revisiting, kind of debate that we had on this podcast before about whether environmental history was losing its way from its methodological foundations. And I see it in graduate studies as well. The dissertations that are coming through our graduate program and other graduate programs are both taking the field of Canadian environmental history into new directions that are aligned with other areas of scholarship, and then also building upon, modifying, or challenging traditional areas of environmental history research, like histories of parks, in ways that are different than when I wrote a history of a park, or even when Alan wrote a history of parks. So that's on the research side of things. On the teaching side, this is more, maybe this is a wish list. I wish I would see this a little bit more, but we've had a lot of innovative teaching materials created over the past 15 years. Textbooks, the teaching modules, the Canadian environmental history modules that were put together with the journal Environmental History. But I think we probably could go a little bit further in terms of creating more open teaching materials, open access teaching materials for teaching environmental history, because I think even in the last decade, the teaching of environmental history at the undergraduate level is still ad hoc, let's say, or it depends. If you happen to be at an institution that happens to have a person who happens to be interested in doing environmental history, you get the opportunity to take an environmental history course. But I'm not sure that environmental history in undergraduate curriculum is something that we could call in Canada a standard. I'm not sure that you could anticipate as an undergraduate student that any program that you went into in history, you could expect that there would be an undergraduate environmental history course that you could take. And I say that for my own undergraduate program as well. Like some years we offer environmental history at the undergraduate level, and some years we offer nothing. And the consequence of that is we continue to get graduate students who discover environmental history in their master's programs or even their doctoral programs, and are not encountering it at the undergraduate level. So I would hope in the future, going forward, that the creation of more easily accessible materials to onboard more people into environmental history, or to integrate those materials into other Canadian history courses, might introduce undergraduate students to environmental history earlier than their graduate studies. And then on organization, I think where we're heading maybe is what Alan was suggesting, is organizationally, maybe niche will start to look a little bit more like an association than, I don't know how we would even describe it today, a looser, less formal organization that provides a variety of high quality services to the research community in Canada, but not in a formal way. And as Alan said, the pathways for members of the community to become active aren't always very clear. And so I think certainly the future does look more formal for niche in terms of its organization, with better opportunities or better pathways for people to become active and participate, including becoming active contributors, so that niche could have funds to do more things, to animate what used to be a lot of niche's core functions, which was research networking. And that happens much more informally now than it used to in the past. You know, there used to be more regional networks where people would meet and share research with each other. Niche used to be able to support more research grant applications than before. And only recently we've been able to provide some digital infrastructure for research projects, but that's something that I think niche should be doing more of into the future. And if we had a more formal structure, that might be easier to facilitate. So why don't we open the floor then to some reflections on what some of our prognostications have been, or perhaps wish lists have been. And I don't know which one to start in. Maybe do you want to start on the organizational question where we left off? Does Canadian environmental history need more formal organization? Does it need, should niche have fees and dues? Do we want to see niche do more research networking than it does now? I've got Alan down as a yes.
Sure.
I think I mean, this obviously is something that we've been talking about in as the executive with niche, but as Alan was speaking there about this, I was becoming more persuaded as you were speaking, Alan, because I think I agree in terms of, I was thinking about this and about ASEH a couple of days ago while I was thinking over these questions. And like you say, there is a significant presence of Canadians at ASEH. I think that, there's very clearly Canadians there. But when you look at the program, it always seems that the panels are they're happening concurrently all together. So it's in some ways it kind of forces people to choose, do we want to go to a Canadian panel? And if we do, we can only go to one because they're all happening at the same time. So I think
I call those canals.
Yeah, I like that.
They're like manels or panels,
yeah.
but they're channels.
Yeah. So, okay. So we have all of the canals that happen at once. I think I tend to agree that as much as I enjoy the ASEH conference, and honestly, one of the reasons I enjoy it so much is because I do get to see all of the Canadian environmental historians at our niche gatherings. But no, I tend to agree that I think in some ways, because that is still sort of our home base for most environmental historians in our organizational base. I think you're right that we're not featured as well as we would probably like to be. And so I think if Canadian environmental historians had our own association, some capacity, then we could start to implement some of these things that both Alan and Sean, that you guys were just talking about, like more opportunities for Canadians to really like more engage and debate and celebrate the work that we're doing, and maybe not be as buried under, you know, the American influence in some ways.
Shannon, what do you think? Should we be getting more involved with the Canadian Historical Association? You're one of the organizers of the conference this year.
It's interesting. When I was listening to you talk, Sean, about an observation you made about the nature of the field, that much really powerful and compelling work in the field of Canadian environmental history has happened at the intersection of Canadian environmental history and other fields like Indigenous history or health history or histories of the North over these past few years. And I think in reflecting on that, I both saw that as you know, a sign of the maturity and the power of the field. But like you, Sean, I also wondered about like, what does it say about our ability to have conversations that are distinct to the concerns of environmental historians? And I wonder if that circumstance isn't one that can be addressed by greater formalization on niche, if niche does become the vehicle through which people who primarily define themselves as environmental historians can meet with each other in more coherent ways, hopefully in ways that also invite in debates and people from other fields, because so much important cross-fertilization happens in that way. But maybe if the moment is right, not just because of the relationship between Canadian environmental history and the ASCH, but also because of the nature of the field in Canada in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say it in some ways for subdisciplines within history in Canada or in Canadian history, there is an inevitability of needing to do that kind of cross collaboration, just because, like our journal publication at Niche that we started a couple of years ago, it has to be capacious in what we look at, just because the field of Canadian environmental history is just too small to be able to publish at any regular pace if we kept the walls too high for more people to see themselves as, feeling that they could publish appropriately with papers in Canadian history and environment. But then again, the question is, as you said, does the field then lose its definition as it becomes wider and wider, or the tent gets bigger and bigger? Alan, I don't know if you share those concerns, or do you think the tent, we still got headroom in this tent, we could bring more people in?
I don't know. I'm just listening right now. I don't think I have a response for you just on that right at the moment.
Okay. Well, I wanted to also do a little bit of reflection on this panel today and think back over the last 10 years. So viewers and listeners might, who have been longtime listeners to this podcast, might know that 10 years ago, there was an event that Niche and the Wilson Institute for Canadian History held in Burlington, Ontario, called EH Plus, Writing the Next Chapter of Canadian Environmental History. And it was a similar exercise to this, which was a kind of forecasting of where the field of Canadian environmental history might go. And so I wondered if the panelists might be able to think back over the last 10 years, excluding Heather, of what has been accomplished in the field. And maybe Alan, you could start us off there.
Okay. Well, I think the words that come to mind are method, digital technologies, and collaboration. I think those are the things that we've been really good at. And I think that we've set a good example for the international field. But maybe even before that, I should say that I think the best thing that Canadian environmental history has accomplished in the last decade is just continuing to nurture and maintain a community that thinks of itself as a community. I think that there's a lot of value in that, and that we see value in talking to one another and learning from one another. I do think that we've been very strong in terms of collaboration. I think is one of the things I'd want to mention, following up on what Heather was talking about. I think, but it's been very much it's been one form of collaboration that it reminds me of daycare when you talk about parallel play. And so you have one or two researchers networking with other one or two researchers, and then they usually produce an edited collection of their research. That's basically how we've worked. And I think we haven't, for the most part, engaged in bigger research teams or use digital technologies to facilitate widespread collaboration. And I really liked the fact that Heather brought up some examples to prove me wrong of that there has been some work in this direction, but I'd really like to see us do more. And I think about a decade ago, Finn Arne Jorgensen invited me to a Nordic Environmental History Network. And he asked what I thought they should do with some funds that they had. And I said, okay, you got to get everybody in the Nordic Environmental Network to contribute at least one entry to this online/print encyclopedic environmental history of the Nordic nations. And I had this great plan for how they should use every cent. It's going to be high quality. It's going to be public facing. And then I walked away from that thinking, why didn't we do that? Why haven't we done that? Like, I think that we could be more defining the field of environmental history, more public facing than we have as yet.
Shannon, what about you? Over the last 10 years, what stands out as accomplishments of the field?
It's a good question. Alan mentioned method, and certainly I was struck in reflecting on the past 10 years that though of course Alan and Bill Turkel had the early collaborative publication or co-edited or edited volume that addressed method. But this past 10 years have brought us two important methodologically focused publications by Jocelyn Thorpe, Stephanie Rutherford, and L. Anders Sandberg, as well as Jennifer Bonnell and Marcel Fortin. So I think those are really important publications in and of themselves, and also signals of how environmental history conversations have taken on greater methodological dimension, another sign of the maturity of the field. And I think our ability to have conversations that are both thematic and topical, but that also relate to the methods we use to define our work and to engage with each other is really important. And I was struck in returning to these pieces in preparation for this conversation, that these are pieces that reflect something we've been talking about already, in that environmental history has grown into a field that involves participation from people who may not primarily define themselves as environmental historians, and they're included as methodologists in these pieces. And so I think it suggests the extent to which the field is really productively going in multiple directions in a variety of ways, thematically, methodologically, and topically. And I think that's a sign of richness.
And Heather, I know you did confess that you might not have as much experience of the last 10 years of environmental history, but I don't want to discount the period of time within that last decade in which you were a graduate student during that time and had a firsthand experience of what the last few years of environmental history looked like in Canada.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing when I was thinking about this question too, to think back 10 years ago when I started grad school at Memorial, and to see how some of these things have shifted. So in terms, there's sort of two things that I was thinking about. One, teaching, and one, research. And I think in terms of teaching, I definitely agree, Sean, with what you were saying, that there are lots of places where environmental history it's not a given that that's going to be a part. However, it has certainly progressed more than when I was an undergrad. Like, I had my only exposure to environmental history as an undergrad was like one unit for like a week in a historiography course. And then it wasn't until I went to Memorial for grad, and I didn't even purposely go for environmental history. John Sandless just sort of like brought me into environmental history.
I'll warn you, John's in the chat right now.
Oh,
so
hi, John.
let's be careful what we say about him.
So, I reading these statements, there were other people that made similar arguments, that it wasn't until they got to grad school. So like, I definitely relate to that in a lot of ways, but I do see now, I think it's more likely to find an environmental history class, even if it's only one, in a history program. But you're right, I think there should be more. And like people were saying in their statements for the EH Plus event, it should be better integrated within like general Canadian history as well. And I would say that in my experience, like when I'm teaching the survey course, because I'm an environmental historian, I do include that. But if I looked at the syllabus of like colleagues that do, it's most likely there aren't environmental elements. So I think that that's one thing that in some ways has changed, but definitely needs some more work. But I guess too, to think about the idea that we're talking about in how environmental history has expanded and brought other people in. Even in my own teaching, both here at St. Mary's and when I taught environmental history as a postdoc and master, it's primarily not history students that are in my environmental history classes. It's primarily students from either other disciplines in the arts or like outside of the arts completely. And, you know, that could be like a whole conversation in itself as to why are history students not like attracted to environmental history, but environmental studies or social justice or like science or psychology students, like why are they the ones that are sort of more drawn to environmental history, which I find it's not really something that I've noticed over time, but I've just noticed since I've started teaching that it kind of seems like environmental history appeals more to like folks outside of history than to those inside. But just quickly, Sean, too, to, you know, when I was reading over the statements in terms of some of the things that people were talking about with like what they think we need more research on, like some of the things that were remarked on was that, and this I think is, I noticed this when I started environmental history, so much of the focus in the early years was on like resources. And like, you know, I do mining history, so I'm still, you know, I still think about resources, but I think it has become more nuanced in the way that we think about resource histories. Like, I think there's much more to look at now that includes things like resource colonialism or settler colonialism and how those things play a role. Energy history, I think, has grown quite a lot, which again helps sort of expand the ways that we think about resources. But you said earlier, I think Sean and Shannon mentioned earlier about the development at the intersection between environmental history and Indigenous studies, which for me, I think is definitely something that I've seen over the course of my like sort of decade exposure here, because I remember when I was doing my graduate studies, there wasn't as much for me to like go and read. But now that I'm supervising master's students, I can say, look, here's all of this great work that like you're able to read and sort of think about how to situate your research in these two areas. And I think a lot of that is coming from a growth of graduate students, particularly in Western Canada over the past decade, doing more research on environment and Indigenous histories. Like I can think of, I'm not going to list everyone, but I can think of like at least 10 people sort of within my like cohort of, not at the U of A, but like my sort of wider network of like folks who graduated around the same time as me with the PhD that are sort of really like blending environmental and Indigenous approaches. And I think that, you know, and like Shannon, what you were saying in terms of method, like the method for those things has grown so much that we have much more to look at, and of course can still be improved, but that's really different than the position that I was in 10 years ago to think like, how am I going to bring these two things together?
And Heather, I think you anticipated some remarks from Stephen Bocking in the chat here, who's reminding us that environmental history isn't always taught in history departments, that he teaches to environmental studies majors, and that environmental history could perhaps be a way of building linkages, breaking down barriers between programs in terms of undergraduate curriculum, which is also true at my institution. Environmental history is taught both in environmental studies and in history and in Canadian studies whenever Colin Coates gets a crack at it over at Glendon College. So I've been thinking too about, you know, that workshop 10 years ago and what was around in 2011 and what wasn't. And I think in the last decade, there's certainly been I would say a robust foundation of scholarship published over the last 10 years. So I'm thinking about, you know, UBC Press will be celebrating 40 books published in the Nature History Society series. Alan is the series editor for the University of Calgary Press series in Canadian history and environment. I don't know what the total number of volumes in that is now, but it's more than 10.
Yes. I should know, but I don't know off the top of my head.
You know, you just
12.
We'll blame 12 the vaccine. Now. Okay. Yeah, it's the vaccine.
That's right.
And then the Rural and Wildland series with McGill Queens has several books in that series now as well. So maybe as a goal, we can try and get an environmental history series at University of Toronto Press. Maybe that's what we have to do next. But that's quite a distance in terms of like a foundation of scholarship to be able to direct students to. So I have had the same experience, Heather, that I've got more literature that I can direct students to and more literature that's Canadian focused, because, you know, a decade ago, we would have to look at more European or American scholarship, or US scholarship, I should say, to find examples. Though there are still gaps, and I'd like to get to talking about some of those gaps as well. But that's one of the big changes, I think, over the last decade that I could point to is the books. And some of that did come out of those conversations 10 years ago about the need to build up the library, and get a larger footprint of scholarship published. I did want to ask about future directions for research too, and I know that participants at the workshop 10 years ago did put their wish lists out for what they'd like to see more research on. But I want to put that question to our panel here too. What new research would you like to see in Canadian environmental history? Where do you see opportunities for expanded scholarship? And Shannon, maybe you might want to start.
Sure. Well, I'll start with a pitch for that new U of T book series, Sean.
Yeah, when's that coming?
I love the book series that we have available to us already. They're robust, they do really important things, they're diverse enough to be complementary. I think what we're missing are really short books that address topical matters that have the public's attention in the field of environmental history. I've really, over the past number of years, been blown away about the power of short books like Adele Perry's Aqueduct, like Adele Perry and Mary Jane McCallum's Structures of Indifference. These are just really powerful historicizations of super important contemporary issues. And I think there's the prospect of using the skills of environmental history to do something similar for specifically environmental issues that need to be historicized for a broader audience. 100 pages, powerful, maybe conceptualized, like in the vein of political ecology, starting from a problem, historicizing from there, as opposed to sort of the more chronological approach that tends to distinguish history and political ecology. So if I were to pitch to U of T, that would be the pitch I would make in terms of the early volumes in that new series. I'd love to see more on gender, more on race, and more dealing with recent decades, 1970s onward. I know I'm not alone among my colleagues in Canadian history, and really looking forward to the upcoming conference on from post-war to the present day. And I'm really keen in particular for, well, all the panels, but the environmental history panels in particular, because I think that though many of us still, sort of work to bring our research and our interpretations close to the present, we tend to get more elusive in those more recent decades. And I think we're at the point where we need to really start putting down strongly evidence-driven benchmarks in our interpretations from the mid-1970s onward.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the strengths of the UBC series as well, being multidisciplinary. So they've been able to fill in that recent past gap that historians leave behind, especially for like the last 20 years, which there's very little historical work on. Because that's definitely a window historians feel least comfortable in, I think. Not to speak for all historians. There's certainly plenty who feel just fine with the year 2005. Heather, what's on your wish list? Where do you think there are new opportunities for research? And then I'm going to start dipping into the chat because there's some good suggestions coming in there.
Sure. So, Shannon, I think that's a great idea. I've also been thinking much more about shorter books, primarily like to assign for teaching, but I also think that the exact books that you use as an example are the ones that I think about too. In terms of impact and like readability for general public, I think is important. I also agree, Shannon, with your point on, like, I think we desperately need more environmental histories of race. And this is something that we've been thinking about with Niche too, with that series. And I've sort of noticed both in my teaching, but also in my writing, that when I come up with discussions about race, I tend to draw more from environmental justice literature than I do from environmental history. And I think, I think environmental history could maybe do better to certainly include race, but also, maybe borrow a little bit from environmental justice literature as well, and thinking about how we can make some of those discussions, more within the realm of environmental history. I also think that gender for sure, but I also think like environmental histories of sexuality, and that's one of the reasons why I think that like Jessica's series on queering environmental history has been so so popular and for the readers, is because we really don't, like, when you start to think about it in the Canadian context, there really isn't that much. And it's like I attended a conference several years ago in Sweden, like an interdisciplinary workshop, and all of these other disciplines like really engaged with this like idea between like environment, nature, and sexuality in really interesting ways. And I sort of left that workshop thinking like, oh, there's like nothing, that I can't really think of much that we could draw on other than a couple of like conference presentations that I've heard over the years. And another thing that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and maybe this is covered, but I don't really think it is, like, I think there are more opportunities for us to explore the like concepts of place. So like this, I'm thinking about this because I've recently read Karen Routledge's Do You See Ice, where she essentially makes a call to action for environmental historians to start thinking about the idea of home more broadly than just the domestic or the family. And she sort of argues that like home is linked with place. And, I think in a lot of ways, as environmental historians, we kind of just like assume that we think about these things. But when I actually started to think about the literature, I realized like we actually don't, like, when we think about place, it isn't connected to ideas of home. And, there are ways that we can approach that. And I think that the Environmental History Now network has done a really great job with their Problems of Place series in exploring some of these ideas. But I think there's room for us to maybe think about that, because I think there is a lot of interesting angles that we could sort of grapple with in that direction as well.
There's a lot to choose from there. Alan, I'll let you bring up the anchor here on this part of the conversation, and then go to the audience.
Okay. I would just say, it's not a cop-out, I swear. I wholeheartedly agree with Shannon and Heather with what they just said. And I really like the way Shannon is pitching directly to the acquisitions editor at the University of Toronto Press. I'm really impressed
Small
by
book
that.
series. There we go.
But I would say, two that weren't mentioned, I think climate history has been criminally underexplored in Canada. And I think if we don't get involved, we'll be kicking ourselves the same way I kick myself for not having Ruth Sandwell's Powering Up Canada book in the Canadian History and Environment series. So as a start, I hope someone out there wants to offer up to edit a collection of climate history. And the other, as much as I'm also participating in that Beyond Post-War, whatever the title of the conference is coming up, I also think that we should be seeing, and we will be seeing, more pre-Confederation environmental history. I mean, I just find it so attractive. The sources are increasingly online. There's not the same access to information concerns. And even what was looked at in the more distant past deserves to be looked at with fresh eyes. Just today, in anticipation of this, I checked, and the fur trade by Innis is from 1930. So, I can see somebody doing some nice, maybe someone needs to do a PhD leading up to the fur trade that bangs in and is completed around 2029 or so for publication.
I think you just made Colin Coates very happy. Call for more early modern environmental histories of Canada. That was one of the areas I was actually going to flag, that I thought that there's so much interesting scholarship on environment and colonialism globally, but Canada is often on the side of those conversations, or also Canada. But so much of Canada, as John Sandloss and Lisa Piper have written about, is not in the temperate zone, and the experiences of ecological imperialism in northern North America are different, but connected to similar flows of biota, as well as flows of political power and European empires conquering indigenous territories in North America. There were two areas that I thought are big areas of opportunity, and it's not just environmental history. Like, I think it's Canadian history generally, and one of it connects to something John Sandlos has pointed out here in the chat, which is about internationalizing Canadian environmental history and thinking about Canadian corporations overseas, capital flows, exchange of ideas, and comparative work. I think probably building up our capabilities in business history and corporate history is essential for understanding environmental history. And not just saying this because that's some of the research I'm doing now. Well, fine, I'm just saying it because it's some of the research I'm doing now. But I'm coming to realize that we have these huge gaps in our knowledge of energy history that I think have been driven by the archive. So we've got a lot of scholarship on public hydroelectric utilities, because you can get into the archives of a public hydroelectric utility, but we have very little scholarship on natural gas, very little scholarship on oil. And if we're thinking about environmental impact, these are huge pieces of understanding climate history that are missing, in part because the records are kept in private corporate archives, and in part because I think that not as many environmental historians come at environmental history with a business history background to be able to work through those records and to know where to find them and how to use them. So that, I think, is just a big, wide open field with lots of opportunity for new research. And then the other area might seem counterintuitive, but I think it's in policy history. So similarly, Heather, I agree with you. I think in queer history, if we're looking to fill a syllabus, we find a chapter out of Kate Sandiland's book, and that's been the book that people go to. In policy history, most of the literature in environmental policy history is written in political science or in law, but not many historians looking at it. So we'll turn to someone like David Boyd, or I'm going to be speaking next week with Angela Carter about her book on energy policy in Canada, and it's in fields that are outside of history where a lot of that work is being done. In the United States, policy history is an enormous field. It's got its own conference, it has its own journal, and there's nothing comparable to it in Canada, in Canadian history. And I think there's big opportunities to be thinking about environmental policy history and how that's changed over time. And I know several historians now are grappling with that, like how the environmental impact assessment process has evolved since the 1970s. Is one question that is still only sort of moderately explored in the scholarship. So big opportunities there. Stephen Bocking agrees with John Sandlos that there's more opportunities for international Canadian environmental history, especially comparative opportunities. And I'm just going to pull another couple of comments here. Ken Cruikshank is saying environmental history has attended to the role of the Canadian state, although we seem to have left the writing of some of the history of national and provincial environmental policy to political scientists. So another good point. And I will also point out that Ken Cruikshank has a background in business history and provided a very good history of the CPR that more people could probably draw upon in the field of environmental history in terms of thinking about the impact of large corporations on the Canadian environment. None more obvious in Western Canadian history than the CPR, I'd say. All right, we are getting close to time, so I'd like to let the audience have a chance to post any questions or comments that they've got into the chat, and I'll relay as many over as possible. We've got some comments here about future panels on business history and the environment. Of course, there have been, and there was a great Canadian Business History Association conference on environmental history a few years ago, which is really good, where I probably made this point back then as well. I've got one last question for the panel, which is about challenges that lie ahead for the field. So maybe I'll get us going on that. And Alan, I'll let you get started. The field has in Canada, I would say, probably started to take off at the end of the 1990s, the beginning of the 2000s. So we've got about 20 good years under our belt as a relatively coherent field. What lies ahead? Subdisciplines of history don't last forever. They dissipate, they change, they evolve. And sometimes people just stop researching in that area. Do you see any potential hazards in the road ahead?
Yeah, I think sometimes that niche first appeared, like one of the dates I give is September 21st, 2004, the same day as my daughter was born, and also the first day of the first episode of Lost. And I always like a line from that show that if we don't live together, we'll die alone. And so when we started Niche, I kind of thought we had this opportunity as a startup, clearly on the cusp of the digital age, with amazing shirk funding, to create an entirely new kind of scholarly network, a community of members who recognize the value of being self-identifying, cross-disciplinary, uniquely cohesive, a little bit intimidating. That was one of the goals, I think. Basically a cult, but largely online and without the uniforms. And we only got that part way there, and that's only to be expected. But I think we need to remember, I like one of the things you said there, Sean, about how disciplines kind of come and go. They do fluctuate. And I think we need to remember as a field that there's nothing intrinsically special about our field, to be honest, compared to any other scholarly field, unless we keep making it special in how we build community, in how we teach, how we write, and how we get our work out there. And increasingly, I think it's in terms of getting our work out there. And I think some of the things that we've talked about already today in terms of like short books, like those are we pretend those are for the public, but they're for ourselves as well, because our attention span is going down as well. I think I've spoken enough. I'm going to leave it over to someone else now.
Okay, Shannon, what do you think? Any hazards on the road ahead? Is environmental history in Canada destined to dissipate, or will we see another 20 great years?
I think the challenges to the field that I worry about the most right now are not unique to the field, but are common to publicly funded post-secondary education in Canada. I know we're all thinking about what's going on at Laurentian University. I'm employed by a post-secondary system that's been subject to pretty catastrophic funding cuts over the previous 2 years, and we're expected to suffer another year of that. The changes to our employment, whether we're talking job loss, whether we're talking about changed conditions of work, whether we're talking about lack of opportunity for secure and meaningful and sufficient employment for colleagues who are precarious or who are student right now. I think that these are challenges that affect our field as they do every other scholarly field. And I think that we need to work with our colleagues in attending to them.
All right, Heather.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot else to add. I think sort of both of those comments together probably hits on some of the challenges. And I think, a challenge is like getting our work out there beyond just speaking to each other. But like Shannon says, also, a part of that challenge is convincing others that we are still relevant, and importantly relevant, like convincing like funding structures and governing institutions and what, basically like Shannon saying, the people and places that sort of have control over not just environmental history, but the humanities and social sciences. But in terms of environmental history, I think maybe like a part of making that case for relevance is continuing to connect with issues that are at the forefront of like the mind of society. So like Shannon, your suggestion for short books, I think is actually really important, because if we can then say, here are the current like environmental crises that we're facing, and here's our scholarship bringing it to the public, reminding people why it's so important for environmental historians to be doing this work, can certainly help. But I think, of course, that's a big like challenge for us to meet as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Keeping the relevance of environmental history at the center of our thinking in terms of designing both our research and the way that we teach is really critical. Because the other challenge I think that we face, and the change that occurred over the last 10 years, I think a lot about undergraduate student enrollment in history. I mean, the biggest change that happened in the last 10 years is about half the number of undergraduate students take history today than they did in 2011 when we held that conference. And so keeping research and teaching relevant in this field, especially at the undergraduate level, I think is probably the biggest challenge going ahead. The good news, I think, is environmental history can be really relevant. It can speak to some of the most pressing issues that are front of mind, whether we're talking about racial justice or we're talking about climate change. Environmental history should be a natural place to try and seek solutions and to understand these problems. But one of the difficulties, I think, is that students, younger students, or let's say incoming undergraduate students, don't think about history as the first place to go to think about those challenges. They go to different social sciences and they go into different programs, and that I think we have to address on the road ahead. Alan?
Could I just jump in and say, I spent years unable to convince undergrads at Western to take my environmental history course, global or Canadian or North American or whatever. And really, it's when I made it into an Anthropocene course that it's really taken off. Even if you don't like the Anthropocene concept, I think it's really worked well as a foot in the door to get students interested in the roots of the current environmental situation. So that's been my gateway drug for environmental history.
Yeah, and I think rethinking the way that we teach environmental history courses is maybe one of the ways to go. Reframing it. Maybe it's not environmental history. Maybe it's the Anthropocene. Maybe it's problem-based courses. I do want to just jump over to the audience here for a minute here. Ken Cruikshank has given me a correction. What he was posting were direct quotes from things he wrote 10 years ago. So Ken is just telling us he's been talking about this for a while. Justin Fisher, who's the Niche New Scholars rep, is adding a point here that he's looking forward. He's already looking and thinking through ways to try and stay engaged with the discipline outside of academia after his degree, and hopes that it won't be a massive challenge, especially important as more of our graduates get careers outside of the academy. And then John is also pointing out the decline in full-time faculty, which has an impact on research output as well as teaching, as there are fewer historians to be doing this work. We're getting close to an hour here, so I think I'm going to wrap it up there with thank yous to all of our panelists and to our audience for joining us here. So thank you very much for spending some time with us this afternoon, Heather Green, Alan MacEachern, and Shannon Stunden Bower. And of course, everyone can find out more about Canadian environmental history from the Niche website at niche-canada.org. Thanks everyone for joining us for the live stream, and come back next week at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, where we'll be doing another live stream event for ASCH Week. We're doing a collaboration with UBC Press's Nature History Society series, featuring 3 of the most recent authors in the series and some reflections on the legacy of the NHS series. So we hope you can join us next week for that. All right, bye everybody.